And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of 10 Minute Theology. We've been talking about angels. Part 11 this week. Part 11 of Angels. We're going to talk about the person of Satan. Who is Satan? Where'd he come from? What's he do? We're going to start getting into all those details. So come along and we will take a look at that this time. Thanks for joining us again. Great to have you. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at what we have. So who is Satan? That's where we're going today. So we'll see what all we have. If I get my slide to change, there it goes. So Satan, the person of Satan. I want to talk about the different names given to Satan. Satan, the devil, those are common ones that we hear. Lucifer as well, at least in the English language. So we'll talk about some other names that are given to him. And along the lines when we're talking about Satan's names, that will by default lead us into a discussion on the activity of Satan really at the same time, because most of the time a name is a good descriptor as well of what that person is doing, what that entity is doing, whatever it may be, right? It gives us more detail than just the person's name in general, especially with an entity like Satan that is given so many different names and titles throughout the breadth of the Bible. So we'll see that as we're going through it. The origin and demise of Satan. Where'd he come from? Where's it going to? We'll actually hit that next time with just a hint of it today at the end of this session. And then also Satan at the temptation with Christ out in the wilderness in Matthew 4, also in Luke chapter 4. We'll talk through that, look at it in detail. And boy, there's some interesting stuff within that maybe you may not have noticed before. Regardless, let's keep going here. The names of Satan. Spent a lot of time on that today. So Satan in the Old Testament, Satan is in the Hebrew. Satanas is how it would be in the Greek. Bottom line, both those words are transliterations of the Hebrew and the Greek words. So when we think about a transliteration, it's not a translation. A translation is where you take a word in another language. Think of Spanish. When you go hola, it is hello in our language. In terms of the name of Satan, we have Satan in the Hebrew, Satanas in Greek. And if we were actually to translate those, it would be translated as adversary. So you can see how I was saying that, hey, it's going to give us a little more info in terms of what Satan is and what his activities are. And we see that immediately with the first name here in Satan, which translated means adversary. So Satan is our adversary as we go through life. 54 times it appears, 18 in the Old Testament and 36 in the New Testament. So just to give you a little flavor of how that is dispersed. Next up is the devil. Diabolos is how it's translated in the Greek, which is also, transliterated in the Greek. Devil, so translated slanderer or the slanderer, okay? It does not occur in the Old Testament. So it occurs 34 times in our Bible. 34 of those times are in the New Testament. So all within the New Testament in terms of diabolos, translated slanderer, and you'll see it occur as the devil, which is pretty interesting because between Satan and the devil, those are the two most occurrences of any specific name or title given for the entity of Satan. You should notice, too, that in the Septuagint, so the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We've talked about it before. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, Septuagint, or the LXX, it's abbreviated. It was done in 2nd or 3rd century BC, so before Christ. You'll hear people say BCE today, before Common Era. Good for them. Regardless of that, it was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it's nice to go to sometimes because it gives us an idea of how Hebrew scholars back then, 200 or 300 years before the advent of Christ, translated Hebrew words into Greek. So it gives us an idea, a better understanding of the vocabulary at that time, which is interesting to look at. But interesting that instead of using Satan in that, the Septuagint actually uses diabolos. So just a little tidbit for you there. Moving along to the next name, the evil one. So really these three here are the top three occurrences of the most commonly occurred name used for Satan, the devil, or the evil one within the entirety of the Bible. So the evil one is actually in the Greek. It does not occur in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, ho poneros, which is translated the evil one. So Poneros is actually an adjective that means evil. And if you were to say the evil, which this does specifically in the Greek, when you use an article, so the direct article, so an article as in the, okay, use it with an adjective instead of saying the evil being the evil. It could be the evil ones in the plural or the evil one in the singular. And that's the way it occurs when we see the evil one translated in the New Testament. Now, 10 times in the New Testament, so 10 times in 10 different verses. I want to show you a very interesting one that is commonly not translated the evil one, but evil instead, even though it specifically says the evil one or the evil in the Greek. And this might be an interesting one, but you go to the Lord's Prayer. So in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. Famous section in the book of Matthew, also occurs in the book of Luke as well. Regardless of that, during the Lord's Prayer, in the middle of it, he says, "And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Most of your Bibles will have a footnote there. If you look down in the very bottom of it or click on it in your electronic version, it'll say, "or the evil one." Why? Because that's specifically what it says in the Greek. I would argue here, instead of saying, "but deliver us from evil," it should be primarily translated, "but deliver us from the evil one." So that gives you a little idea of how the translation can matter at different times, and also in places where it appears that we may not realize first at all. Let's keep moving on here, looking at more names. So the names of Satan continued. Well, what about Lucifer? We talked about that, and that's a common name in the English, right? We think of the devil, we think of Satan, we think of Lucifer as the three major names that we would call Satan. But what about Lucifer? So it actually only occurs once in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. It's in the book of Isaiah in chapter 14, verse 12. Now, notice the New American Standard said, how have you, if I can talk here we go. "How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of dawn, you have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations." Where you go, well, wait a minute, but Lucifer isn't in there, right? Well, let's take a look at the same verse in the King James. If you were to look at the New King James as well. "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" So a little difficult in the King's English there, right? As you read this from, of course, King James Version was created back in 1611, one of the first major English Bibles that just has an incredible past track record. But regardless, they translated the word here, Lucifer, as opposed to translating it, they transliterate it. What did they transliterate it from? It's actually from the Latin Vulgate. So the Latin Vulgate is another translation of the Bible that was done in the third or fourth century AD. Okay, so post-Christ it was. So a little more recent than the Septuagint, but it was in Latin because Latin had become the common vernacular, the common language spoken at that time. Latin Vulgate is well known for all this, but it came directly from there. So Lucifer occurs in the Latin Vulgate, and what it actually means is light bearer, shining one, or morning star if it were to be translated, okay? But it's made its way into our English Bible. At least the King James and the New King James are the two versions that have that as Lucifer, which is where we get that other name from. So if you're wondering where Lucifer came from, there you go. That's exactly where it came from. Okay, moving along here. Names of Satan continue here. What about the serpent? You're like, okay, well, let's talk about the serpent, right? Well, it's implied in the Old Testament, okay? In Genesis 3, back in the garden, most of us know the story, right? In reading in Genesis 3:1, so before the fall of Adam and Eve, before they sinned, we read, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden." And on it went, right? And basically he tricks her into taking the fruit, and she gives it to Adam, who was with her, by the way, and he ate it too, and they fell. You know, they could do anything. We're only told that they were told not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which unfortunately they did. And mankind fell since then, and since then we've been dealing with the outcropping of it, right? 2 explicit times in the New Testament serpent occurs. In Revelation 12:9, and this is great because it pulls it all together. So check this out. In Revelation 12:9, we read, And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So this is a great verse. It pulls it all together. It equates the great dragon. It equates the serpent of old. So back in the garden, it was also called the devil and Satan. So it takes these four terms used of Satan or the devil and equates them to this entity known as Satan or the devil, which we commonly use to identify them by. Similar to the same thing occurs in Revelation 20 verse 2. Again, it equates these four things: the dragon, the serpent, the devil, and Satan as being the same person. Okay, let's keep looking what we have, and more names of Satan. And here, there's a bunch of them, actually, quite a few, in different titles of how Satan is referred to in the Bible. We have the ruler of this world, the god of this world, the father of lies. You can see none of these paint him in a real good picture, do they? It's all deception based. Gives us an idea of, again, what is Satan doing? Well, clearly he's out there trying to deceive and trying to spread lies. The prince of the power of the air is interesting when you look at Ephesians 2, especially then if you fast forward to Ephesians 6, where we read that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spirits, against principalities, against the rulers of the air, right? I mean, as we look at that verse, it's an interesting comparison of the two. Deceiver of the whole world, Revelation there, 12:9. The accuser of the brethren, the accuser, again, accuser of the brethren, of our fellow believers, right? That's what Satan is doing constantly, is accusing the brethren, accusing the believers. And boy, let us not forget that in 1 Peter 5:8, it talks about Satan as a roaring lion. It says, and actually it's interesting because it starts with a command: be on guard, be on alert, that Satan roams about as a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. So quite a graphic picture of what Satan is out and about doing on a day-to-day basis. Here's an interesting one, though. In 2 Corinthians, an angel of light. So we sit there and we say, hey, what does Satan look like? He's probably this horrific creature, but wait a minute, also appears as an angel of light. What's that all about? So let's take a look at this real quick, because in this section of Scripture, Paul is actually warning people about false apostles, false workers, false teachers of false doctrine within the church. And so let's take a look at these two verses in 2 Corinthians 11:13 through 14. Notice it says, for such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ, disguising themselves. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So Satan is not out pretending to be the bad guy all the time. In fact, Satan clearly from this is disguising himself as an angel of light, someone who's good, someone who can be counted on, someone who can be entrusted, when in reality, we know behind the scenes, he is not. So what does Satan look like? You get a lot of artist depictors, and there's a lot of depictions out there, right? Here's just one from 1847, an oil on canvas of Alexandre Cabanel. You can take a look at it there if you want to read more about it. But if you look, right, and you say, okay, it looks like an angel, has wings, which is kind of interesting, and maybe Satan does have wings. We'll talk about that a little more in future episodes. But if you look deep at this picture, and you have to Google it to find it, there's actually a tear coming out of his eye in this painting. So that's what makes this also painting as well. This is right after he was cast out, and there's a tear there because he knows he blew it. Now, did he really shed a tear? We have no way of knowing, right? But yet, regardless, it's an interesting oil painting, and I think it depicts an interesting theological premise as well. So, a lot of people think that Satan looks like this. You see it in the movies, all over the place, right? And it's like he's this evil, scary-looking red creature with wings, horns, and fire all around him. Before we drop to a picture such as this, though, let's consider one more interesting thing. There's another description of Satan, and it's quite an interesting one. It's before his fall. We read that he was the anointed one, that he was a guarding cherub. And we see that in Ezekiel 28. So let's look at a few of these verses here. We read in verse 12 that you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Goes on to describe all the stones if you look at the verse. In verse 14, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I could also read who guards. and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. Verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. And that's the key of what happened. Unrighteousness was found in Satan, and he was cast out. But notice in verse 12, seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. You were in Eden. Every precious stone was your covering. You were the anointed cherub who guards. Placed there, you were in the holy mountain. You were blameless on your ways until unrighteousness was found in you. And that's why when we look at this description of Satan, I think instead of looking like the scary red horned winged creature with fire all around him, I think he may look more like this. Couple that with the fact that he appears as an angel of light and is out to deceive people, I would put my money on looking more like this than the scary looking winged creature with fire all around them as depicted in movies and in a lot of art. So something to think about, and we will talk about that more next time as we talk more about his origin and his fall, how he was cast out, what occurred, where do we find that, and then of course his ultimate demise. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. It's an interesting study as you start thinking about Satan and all of that and what the Bible actually says about Satan as opposed to what we read in the movies and everything else. So take care. Have a great week, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.